Thanks for joining us again today. My name is Zsuzsa Neuebauer, and together with Greta, we have invited some extraordinary scientists to talk about the science here today with us. Before we hear from the science, Greta and me will say a few words, and to the end of the session, there will be time for questions, and later there's also time for interviews with the scientists. I will explain that further on. But first of all, Greta, it's your time to speak.
Yeah, well, thank you everyone for coming here. Mine and Luisa's voice have been heard many times, and it is amazing that so many young people from all around the world are being heard. But we also need to listen to the scientists and the experts. And Luisa and I are not scientists, so that's why we have invited these amazing people, scientists, to share what needs to be shared. Today in mainstream media, the science is not being represented the way it needs to be, and we no longer have time to leave out the science from the conversation.
Now here today, we ask you to listen very carefully to the science, because this is the science that we need right now and that we see is missing from negotiations that are far beyond where we need to be and that don't seem to understand that we are in a crisis that gives us no further single day of negotiations to lose. Next, I'm very, very delighted to ask William Moomaw to share your thoughts. William Moomaw was one of the 5 authors of the World Scientists' Warning on a Climate Emergency, endorsed by over 11,000 scientists from across the globe. He's also at the Fletcher School. Thank you so much for making it today.
Thank you, Luisa, and thank you, Greta. We did not invent the term climate emergency, you did. Climate emergency implies something serious is happening or about to happen, and we have a responsibility to try to stop it. That urgency, we see it around here. The time is now, time for action. It's all over the signs. And yet, what do we see but ongoing negotiations that are not leading to action? Let's be clear. We're no longer talking about climate change. The climate has changed. These young women here were born into a different climate than I was born into. And they will see a different climate than I will live long enough to see. This change in the climate is actually a symptom. It's a symptom of the unsustainable way in which we have been unraveling the fabric of life on this planet. We have been destroying the forest that, like the oceans, are responsible for absorbing more than a quarter of all the carbon dioxide that we emit every single year. Isn't it amazing? We humans put 11 billion tons in the atmosphere and it only increases by less than 5. Who has been helping us? The oceans, the forests, the wetlands, the grasslands. And we are in the process of destroying them. So why would 5 scientists, 1 from South Africa, 1 from Australia, 2 from the state of Oregon, and 1 from the state of Massachusetts, decide to write something like this? And how in the world, I'm asked, did you get 11,000 scientists to agree? My response is, it's nearly impossible to get 11 scientists to agree on just about anything. We just put this up on the internet. 11,000, more than 11,000, and another 1,000 since then have signed on. From 153 countries, from China, from India, from Ethiopia, from Brazil, from the United States, one of the worst offenders, obviously, The European Union, actually in second place in terms of total emissions of carbon dioxide since the Industrial Revolution. Let me say something about the myth of climate neutrality. Climate neutrality means that I can continue emitting and someone else, someplace else, at some other time will somehow plant enough trees or do something to remove that amount of carbon dioxide. Now, not all of you may be proficient in higher mathematics, but you don't need to be to understand the simple fact that in order to meet the 1.5 degree goal, we must reduce our emissions by 7.6% a year for the next 10 years. You cannot do that with carbon neutrality. If we continue to cut down our forest, continue to subsidize our fossil fuels, continue to subsidize the cutting down of forest, to burn them to replace fossil fuels in our coal plants in Europe and the United States, we're not going to get there. The myth of carbon neutrality for bioenergy is exactly that. It's a myth. And here in Europe, it is leading not only to the destruction of forests in places like Estonia and Lithuania, but in the United States. We ship 12 million tons a year for a single power plant in the UK. That's out of our forests. UK doesn't get charged with that because of the mistaken accounting system we have. The United States is supposed to report it. We don't have to because we refuse to be a party to the Kyoto Protocol. Loophole after loophole after loophole. And today and the rest of this week, there will be negotiations over more loopholes. Will some countries be allowed to double count the forests they grow that someone pays them to protect and then count it as their own? Will we adjust the baseline so that basically some countries get to start, as someone said, halfway down the track in a race rather than back at the beginning with everyone else? We cannot afford any more of this. And I just want to say, as scientists, and I can obviously not be inside the head of all 11,000 scientists who supported this, but I think all of them would agree, we have to stop dithering over creating more opportunities to put more carbon in the atmosphere and subsidize it. By the way, all of these countries are subsidizing the fossil fuels. Subsidies went up since 2010, not down, for fossil fuels. And they are increasing for bioenergy as well. Nearly 800 scientists in January of last year wrote to the European Parliament and asked to remove the subsidies for bioenergy and were ignored. All of us bear blame for this. Let's not play the blame game. Let's just get on with solving the problem. I first learned of climate change in the 1960s. I first taught a course that included it in 1970. I began to work full-time on climate change in 1988. These two young women here should not have to live their lives having to work on climate change till they're my age. Thank you.
It is indeed strange that the disconnect between the movement on the street and the negotiations here in these rooms seems to have never been bigger than in these days when everyone talks about the climate. We have now some time for questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Mark McCaffrey. I'm with ECOS, which is the Education, Communication, and Outreach Group. And my concern is that we've known about the science for decades, and yet often it's missing completely in school. And I know Greta and you and others have done your homework and learned about how important, how vitally imperative this is that we take action, maybe from what you've learned in school, probably from listening to scientists. But what role do you feel is, especially those of you who are scientists, what role does education play in transforming society to a low impact, low carbon lifestyle and society? Because right now, education, the higher education level people have, the higher their environmental impact is. And that, so in other words, education is now actually part of the problem. How do we transform education?
Thank you so much. I suggest we pass on the microphone to you. They have a question about education, veganism, and the report to triple ambitions.
Sure. I think the power of science and knowledge is that it gives us explains the problem, but also gives us a clear sideline to what the solution is, cutting our emissions as quickly and as deeply as possible. So absolutely, we need to do this in the schools from a very young age, but I would say, unfortunately, we need to shake a lot of adults out of the stupor they're in, sort of in this business as usual way in which we're operating. So this kind of knowledge and education is important right down the line from kids up. I've actually been very impressed with young children today who are going out and seeking that knowledge, and it's again really upsetting to see science get politicized in some contexts so that people don't have access to the right information. In terms of what we can do, obviously we have to go after this deeply, every one of us, and then as countries. We need to do both, though. I would say we need to make really conscious choices in our daily lives, how we drive our transport, what we eat, all those kinds of things. But make no mistake, without significant action from national governments, we are not going to meet our climate goals. So it's both and we have to keep the pressure on our political leaders.
Yeah, let me just add to that. Most of my time on the IPCC was spent on the technological solutions for emissions reduction. About 10 years ago, I began to realize that wasn't going to be enough. And since nature was already doing all of these, removing more than half of what we put in every year, is there any way to increase the capacity of nature to do so? And the answer is yes. Our forests of the world could be absorbing twice as much carbon as they are today. Instead of absorbing a quarter of what we emit, it would be half of what we emit today. And at the same time, if we reduce our emissions, that would really work. What does that require? It requires us letting some trees grow, letting some forests grow. We talk about afforestation, reforestation, great things to do, will make a difference 70 years from now. But it is the trees that are growing now that will rapidly, in the next 10 years, remove substantial amounts of carbon dioxide. We call that process proforestation. And we have to understand that the destruction of biodiversity is not it's nice to have lots of animals and plants around. No, it's essential to the functioning of the natural systems, our forests, our wetlands, our grasslands, our oceans, the biological diversity of species. We've lost 70% of vertebrate population in 40 years. We are headed in the wrong direction. We really have to take into account the role of the natural world and use our technology to reduce emissions, use the natural world to remove the carbon dioxide. We cannot wait for another decade or 2 decades to build carbon dioxide sucker-uppers that are going to take it out of the atmosphere. We have the capacity now with nature, as long as we don't keep destroying it.
Yes, it is extremely important that we get the science in the school curriculum, but also that we educate adults. At least my experience is that pretty much no one is fully aware and has access to the kind of information that we need to have access to, and we cannot translate the science that is available to something that we can relate to. So we need to be able to translate these numbers into grasping the sense of urgency. Both children, but also since we can't wait for the children of today to grow up and become the ones in charge, we also need to educate the people who are in charge today and the people who are adults today. So we need to educate everyone.
On the issue of meat does contribute a significant amount to greenhouse gas emissions in how it's produced, in how it's processed, and how it's transported. And reducing meat consumption is one way of reducing one's own emissions, one's own direct emissions. And it's one of many ways that one can reduce one's own direct emissions. Your choices about transport, your choices about what products you consume. And you can have an impact on emissions, you can have an educational impact, you can have a movement building impact by your choice of lifestyle. But I think it's also important to recognize the limits of trying to fix this broken system one consumer at a time. Part of the reason why we don't make those choices is sometimes we can't make those choices. Or those choices simply aren't available, or they're extremely hard to make. Or they take such an investment of time and money that it just feels like too much of a sacrifice. And this is because it's not just the eating of a portion of meat, it's the food system that's the problem. It's not just taking a particular trip, it's the transportation system that's the problem. It's our system of manufacturing things and transporting things. And I think this has to be seen in terms of, as has been said before, a system that we've created, a system that many of us have become prosperous on, but which isn't a sustainable system. It's not a model by which the entire world can become prosperous. And in order to have a world in which there isn't perpetual, enormous inequality, which is not a sustainable world, an enclave society like that simply can't last. In order to avoid that dystopian scenario, we need to think about the ways in which the fundamental systems, the industrial systems, the political systems, need to change in order to make a more sustainable world possible.
My question is, how can those of us who aren't in positions of power and maybe leaving school, how can the 99%, what's the most direct way we can have an impact and we can make a change?
Okay. Thank you so much for this question. So I suggest we have a very quick statement from each of you.
In terms of what young people can do, what you're doing is already amazing because you're changing the politics. We have the technologies. What we have to change is the politics. You're already helping to do that. When you're old enough, wherever you are, please vote. It's the most important thing you can do in democracies. Vote, please.
Yeah, I would just have to echo this. I think there are lots of things we can do. We can all recycle. We can switch out light bulbs, etc. But really, the most important thing is political change. We have a political system that's very, very responsive to those interests that are very happy with the status quo. And that needs to change. And I think it's also it's crucial that you do it in a way that helps you maintain hope. I think that hope is something that will allow this problem to be solved, this transformation to happen. I think that technologies alone, the right policies alone, information alone, that won't do it. I think what we really do need is hope. So as you act, as you take action, as you try and make change, do it with people who can help give you hope.
Of course, there are many things you can do in your everyday life to reduce your own ecological footprint, but especially to inform yourself and inform others, because right now the gap of the lack of information, the lack of knowledge is so big, and we need to fill that gap. So we need to spread the information, and we need to spread awareness, and we need to start treating this crisis like a crisis, and you can be a part of that, not only as an individual, but also as a small part of a big movement to just put pressure on people in power. And yes, voting is very important, but democracy is not only on election day, it is every second, and public opinion is what runs the free world. So we cannot just sit here and say, oh, I will just wait for election day. You have to do something today, because as a democratic citizen, that is your responsibility.
Question came up about criminal activity. There is criminal activity, and here in Europe, I have a colleague working in Eastern Europe, and a lot of the deforestation there for timber and for bioenergy is coming from, among other things, UNESCO World Heritage Sites, and those are criminal activities. But we really should, I agree with Shivan, this has to be about hope. We have to believe that we can make it change. If there are a lot of us even doing a little, it adds up to a lot. But we really do have to change the political structure. We have to change the nature of our economy, which rewards doing destructive things that are destroying the planet. And so we need to work on all of those simultaneously. And I find, having worked on this for so long, people ask, don't you get discouraged? Well, I have my bad days, I'll grant you that. But what keeps me going is the opportunities I see to make a difference here, make a difference there. Let's change our society, let's change our economy, let's make those sustainable. And I suggest take a look at the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. There's 17 of them. They're not binding, but there are a lot of pretty good ideas there. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us today.